Viewer discretion advised. This is a dramatized narrative inspired by true events. Some sections are entirely fictional. He was known on MTV as a genius, but nobody had heard the Montage of Heck tapes he assembled in the darkness of his studio at midnight, piecing together incomprehensible sound fragments. This sound laboratory was the last refuge, closed to everyone, where Cobain's genius and madness were at their most naked. March 17, 1994. Sound engineer Marcus Webb sat in a dimly lit storage facility in Seattle, surrounded by cardboard boxes filled with cassette tapes. He'd been hired by Kurt Cobain's management to catalog and digitize the singer's personal archive before it was moved to a more secure location. Most of the tapes were labeled Practice Session, Jan 88, Bleach Demos, Nevermind Outtakes. Standard stuff for a rock archive. But then Marcus found a box that was different. The cardboard was water damaged, covered in coffee stains, and what looked like cigarette burns. Inside were approximately 40 cassettes, each one labeled in Kurt's distinctive handwriting with variations of the same phrase, Montage of Heck. Monosane 1, the beginning. MOH, Net 7, Noise Experiments. MOH 10 and 12, Do Not Erase. MOH 223, Do Not Listen. MOH 37, Final Version. Marcus picked up tape T23, the one marked Do Not Listen. Years later, in an interview he gave to a documentary filmmaker, Marcus would say that warning should have been taken seriously. He slid the cassette into his professional deck, put on his studio headphones, and pressed play. What came through those headphones wasn't music. It was something else entirely. The tape began with silence, 10 seconds of complete nothingness. Then, gradually, sounds began to emerge. A baby crying, but the cry was slowed down, stretched, distorted, until it sounded like a creature from another dimension. Underneath that, the sound of running water, then laughter, high-pitched and manic, layered over itself dozens of times until it became a chorus of madness. Marcus checked his notes. This was supposed to be Kurt Cobain's experimental home recordings. But what he was hearing felt like something far more personal, far more disturbing than experiments. This felt like documentation of a mind unraveling in real time. At minute 4:37, a new sound emerged. Kurt's voice, whispering, "Nobody knows, nobody knows, nobody knows," repeated 23 times, each repetition slightly different in pitch and speed, creating an unsettling echo effect. Then came the guitars. But these weren't the power chords that defined Nirvana. These were fractured, discordant, deliberately wrong. Kurt had recorded himself playing the same chord chordage over and over, each take slightly out of tune with the previous one, creating a wall of sound that felt like it was collapsing in on itself. Marcus had worked with experimental musicians before, Sonic Youth, Melvins, even some avant-garde classical composers. But this was different. This wasn't experimentation for artistic purposes. This felt like therapy, like exorcism, like someone trying to externalize internal chaos. At minute 12:15, Marcus heard something that made him pause the tape and remove his headphones for a moment. It was the sound of someone sobbing, mixed with the sound of a television telling a sitcom laugh track. The juxtaposition was so jarring, so deliberately painful, that Marcus had to take a breath before continuing. The facility where Marcus worked was cold. That March evening, rain hammered against the metal roof of the storage building, creating its own rhythm that seemed to sync with the chaos coming through his headphones. He'd been working alone for 6 hours straight, and the isolation was starting to affect him. Or maybe it was the tapes themselves. When Brett Morgan, the documentary filmmaker who would later create the Montage of Heck documentary in 2015, first heard about these tapes, he spent 3 years trying to gain access to them. Kurt's estate was protective, cautious about releasing material that might damage Kurt's legacy or cause pain to his family. But when Brett finally got permission to listen to the complete archive in 2012, he understood why the estate had been hesitant. These tapes weren't just experimental music, they were a sonic diary, an audio documentation of Kurt Cobain's internal struggle with fame, addiction, pain, and identity. The first time I heard the Montage of Heck tapes, Brett later said in an interview, I had to stop after 20 minutes. Not because they were bad, but because they were too intimate, too raw. It felt like I was listening to someone's therapy sessions, their nightmares, their breakdowns. Kurt had essentially created a sound collage of his psychological state, and it was absolutely devastating. The tapes dated back to 1982 when Kurt was just 15 years old. The earliest recordings were simpler, Kurt experimenting with his first 4-track recorder, layering his voice singing Beatles songs over recordings of his grandmother's television playing in the background. Even then, there was something unsettling about his approach. He wasn't trying to make something beautiful. He was trying to make something that captured how fragmented reality felt to him. Tape 10-1, labeled The Beginning, was recorded in Kurt's childhood bedroom in Aberdeen, Washington. You could hear the rain outside, the same persistent northwest rain that would follow Kurt throughout his life. Over that rain, teenage Kurt had layered his own voice, humming melodies that would later become Nirvana songs, though they were unrecognizable in this form, stretched and distorted beyond recognition. But what made Tape 10-1 particularly haunting was a moment at the 23-minute mark, where all the sound dropped out except for Kurt's natural speaking voice. March 15th, 1982. I'm 15 years old today. Mom forgot again. Dad didn't call. I'm making this tape because I need to remember what it feels like to be this alone. Not sad alone. Just alone. Like I'm the only real person and everyone else is just background noise. Then the cacophony returned. Feedback. Distortion. The sound of something being destroyed. Marcus Webb later told journalists that hearing that moment, that raw teenage confession buried in experimental noise, made him realize he wasn't just cataloging music. He was cataloging evidence of a specific kind of suffering, the kind that starts early and never really stops. Tape 10-7, labeled Noise Experiments, featured 38 minutes of what could only be described as controlled chaos. Kurt had recorded himself destroying things, smashing plates, tearing paper, breaking glass, and then he'd arrange these sounds into rhythmic patterns. Between the destruction you could hear him laughing, then crying, then laughing again. But there was method to the madness. Music professor Dr. Sarah Chen, who analyzed the Montage of Heck tapes for a 2016 academic paper, noted that Kurt's sound collages followed specific structural patterns. He's not randomly throwing sounds together, Dr. Chen wrote. There's a deliberate architecture to the chaos. He builds tension through layering, releases it through silence, or sudden shifts in texture. It's experimental composition at its most raw, but it's still composition. Dylan Carlson, Kurt's best friend and the person who sold him the shotgun he would use to end his life, remembered Kurt working on these tapes. He'd be up until 4 or 5 in the morning in his room, wearing headphones, working on these sound collages. He called it his audio diary. He said it was the only way he could express what was really going on in his head. The songs for Nirvana had to be structured, had to make sense to other people. But the Montage of Heck stuff, that was just for him. But Kurt's girlfriend at the time, Tracy Miranda, had a different memory. She recalled one night in early 1990, before Nirvana had blown up, when she woke up at 3 a.m. to strange sounds coming from Kurt's workspace. She found him sitting on the floor, surrounded by cassette players, each one playing different sounds simultaneously, while he recorded the result on a master tape. He looked up at me. Tracy remembered in a 2008 interview, and his eyes were completely empty. Not sad, not angry, just empty. He said, I'm trying to record what it sounds like in my head. I asked him what he meant, and he said, this is what it sounds like every day. All these sounds, all at once, no way to turn them off. That's when I started to understand that Kurt wasn't making art. He was documenting illness. The apartment they shared in Olympia was small, barely 400 square feet, and Kurt's recording equipment took up most of their living space. Tracy described walking through a maze of cables, microphones, and tape players just to get to the bathroom, but she never asked him to stop or to clean it up, because she understood, even then, that this chaos was keeping him alive. Tape 10-14, recorded in December 1990. right after Nirvana had signed with DGC Records, contained what might be the most disturbing moment in the entire archive. For 17 minutes, there's just the sound of Kurt breathing into the microphone. But it's not normal breathing. It's panicked, hyperventilating, the kind of breathing associated with severe anxiety attacks. Then, at minute 17:42, Kurt's voice cuts through. "I can't do this. I can't do this. I can't do this." He repeats this phrase 47 times, each repetition more desperate than the last, before the tape abruptly ends with the sound of something being thrown against a wall. This was recorded 3 weeks before Smells Like Teen Spirit would be written, 3 months before Nevermind would be recorded, 9 months before Kurt Cobain would become the most famous rock star on the planet. He already knew he couldn't handle what was coming. The prophecy was there, documented in magnetic tape, waiting to be discovered. Marcus Webb, the sound engineer cataloging the tapes in 1994, later said that listening to the Montage of Heck archive in chronological order was like watching someone's psychological decline in audio form. The early tapes were chaotic, but playful. The middle tapes were chaotic and searching. The later tapes were chaotic and desperate. By the time I got to the tapes from 1993 and 1994, Marcus recalled, the playfulness was completely gone. These weren't experiments anymore. They were cries for help, documented in a language only Kurt understood. Taped in 28, recorded in June 1992, during the height of Nevermind's success, featured Kurt sampling news reports about himself and mixing them with recordings of his own screaming. You could hear a CNN anchor saying Kurt Cobain, voice of a generation, immediately followed by Kurt shrieking, I'm not, over and over, until his voice broke into a raw, painful rasp. Underneath that, Kurt had layered the sound of applause from Nirvana concerts, but he'd reversed the tape, so the applause sounded like a rushing wind, like the sound of everything being sucked away into nothingness. The effect was claustrophobic, suffocating, like being crushed under the weight of expectation. Then there was tape down 33, which Kurt had labeled the pain tape in shaky handwriting. This was recorded during one of Kurt's worst periods of stomach pain, the chronic condition that had plagued him since childhood, and that many believe drove him to heroin use as self-medication. For 52 minutes, the tape documented Kurt's attempts to distract himself from physical agony. He'd recorded himself playing guitar, but you could hear him gasping in pain between notes. He'd recorded himself hitting from his favorite books, Perfume by Patrick Süskind and Naked Lunch by William S. Burroughs. But his voice would trail off into groans of discomfort. He'd recorded the sound of himself vomiting, then mixed it with samples of beautiful classical music, Debussy's Clair de Lune, creating a horrifying juxtaposition of elegance and suffering. Medical records later revealed that Kurt's stomach condition was likely a combination of undiagnosed irritable bowel syndrome, scoliosis-related nerve pain, and the psychological manifestation of childhood trauma. But in 1993, doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong with him, and Kurt self-medicated with whatever he could find. The pain tape was his attempt to give form to formless suffering, to make the invisible visible, or in this case, to make the unfelt felt. Anyone who listened to that tape, according to those who have heard it, came away with a visceral understanding of what chronic pain actually means. Chris Novoselic, Nirvana's bassist, remembered Kurt playing him parts of the Montage of Heck tapes during tour bus rides. He'd sometimes bring a tape to practice and say, "Listen in this," and we'd hear these absolutely insane sound collages. At first I thought he was just being weird, experimental, Kurt being Kurt. But then I realized these tapes were like his journal. Other people write down their thoughts. Kurt recorded his. Chris also remembered a specific incident in August 1993, during the Enduro tour. Kurt had brought tape 1035 to the bus and insisted that Chris and Dave Grohl listen to it. The tape featured Kurt reading his suicide note from Rome, the one from the March 1994 incident that most people believed was his first suicide attempt, except this recording was from 8 months earlier. He'd already written it, Chris said in a 2003 interview that was never fully published. 8 months before Rome, he'd already written the note, and he'd recorded himself reading it over this horrible droning sound. When the tape ended, Dave and I just looked at each other. We didn't know what to say. And Kurt just smiled and said, "Don't worry, I'm not going to do it yet." Yet. He said yet, but it was Dave Grohl who noticed something specific about the tapes. The later ones, Dave said in a 2011 interview, they all had this underlying sound, this low-frequency hum that you could barely hear but that you could feel in your chest. I asked Kurt about it once, and he said it was the sound of his tinnitus. He'd point the microphone directly into his own ear canal and record the ringing that never stopped. Then he'd use that as the base layer for everything else. Every single sound in those later tapes was built on top of the sound of his own suffering. The tinnitus, Kurt had explained to Dave, was the one sound he could never escape. It was there when he woke up, there when he tried to sleep, there in between songs at concerts, there in moments of silence. So he recorded it, made it the foundation of his audio diary, forced the world that would eventually listen to experience what he experienced every moment of every day. Tape Tin 37, labeled Final Version, was recorded in March 1994, just 3 weeks before Kurt's death. When Marcus Webb played this tape in that Seattle storage facility on March 17th, he didn't know yet that Kurt was dead. The body wouldn't be discovered for another 3 weeks, but listening to this tape, Marcus would later say he felt a coldness run through his entire body. A premonition of something terrible. The tape opened with Kurt's voice, clear and calm, more lucid than it had been on any of the previous recordings. This is Montage of Heck, number 37, March 1st, 1994. This is the sound of my mind. This is what it's like to be me. If you're listening to this, I'm probably already gone. I don't mean dead. I mean gone from myself. I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know if I ever did. What followed was 73 minutes of the most complex layered sound collage Kurt had ever created. It was a retrospective, a summary, a final statement, samples from his childhood. His mother's voice reading him a bedtime story. His father's voice yelling during the divorce, the sound of his childhood home in Aberdeen, recordings from Nirvana concerts, the roar of crowds, the crunch of guitars, his own voice singing words that millions of people knew by heart but that felt alien to him. The sound of Frances Bean crying as a newborn, mixed with Courtney's laughter from their wedding day. News reports about his drug use, about the Rome incident, about the intervention that would happen just weeks after this tape was recorded. Clips from interviews where journalists asked him about being the voice of a generation, and you could hear the exhaustion in his responses, the weight of expectations he never wanted. All of it woven together with feedback distortion, and underneath it all, that ever-present hum of tinnitus, the sound that never stopped, the sound that defined his existence. And at minute 68:33, buried so deep in the mix that Marcus almost missed it even with his professional studio monitors, Kurt's voice whispering, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I couldn't make it stop. I tried everything. I tried music. I tried love. I tried drugs. I tried therapy. I tried anger. I tried acceptance. But it never stops. The noise never stops. Maybe death will be quiet. Maybe that's all I really want. Just quiet." Marcus Webb sat in that storage facility, rain hammering the metal roof, listening to a dead man's confession that had been recorded weeks before he died, and he broke down. He would later tell his therapist that he felt like he'd been entrusted with something sacred, something terrible, something that nobody should have to carry alone. When Brett Morgan finally made his documentary, he could only use fragments of the Montage of Heck tapes. The full archive was too intense, too personal, too disturbing for public consumption. Even the edited version that appeared in the documentary shocked viewers with its raw intimacy. But those who have heard the complete archive, all 40-plus tapes spanning 12 years of Kurt's life, describe it as one of the most important artistic documents of the 20th century. Not because it's beautiful or entertaining, but because it's truthful in a way that most art never achieves. Dr. Patricia Andrews, a psychologist specializing in creative expression and mental illness, was granted access to the tapes in 2017 for research purposes. Her analysis concluded, what Kurt created with Montage of Heck was essentially a form of audio psychotherapy. He was externalizing internal chaos, giving form to formless suffering, creating a mirror of his mental state that he could observe and analyze. It's both a symptom of his illness and an attempt to treat it. Kurt Cobain spent over a decade recording the sound of his own mind deteriorating. He documented his pain, his creativity, his madness, his genius, all in a format that most people would never hear or understand. The Montage of Heck tapes weren't meant for us. They were meant for him, a way of making sense of the noise inside his head by turning it into actual noise outside his head. But perhaps there was also a part of him that hoped someone would find these tapes after he was gone, that someone would listen and understand what it had been like to be Kurt Cobain. Beyond the fame, beyond the music, beyond the mythology, that someone would hear the truth. Marcus Webb, who spent 3 weeks in that storage facility cataloging every tape, transferring them to digital format, documenting every sound, later said, people think they know Kurt Cobain, they know the songs, the interviews, the public persona, they know the grunge icon, the reluctant spokesman, the tragic figure, but nobody knows the real Kurt, except the people who've heard those tapes. And even then, I'm not sure we really know him. We just know what his suffering sounded like. We know the texture of his pain, the architecture of his chaos, the soundtrack to his deterioration. The Montage of Heck tapes remain in Kurt's estate archive, with limited access, granted only for specific documentary or educational purposes. Most of them will probably never be heard by the general public. And maybe that's how it should be. These weren't performances, they were confessions, documented in the only language Kurt Cobain truly felt comfortable with, sound itself. Courtney Love, in one of her rare statements about the tapes, said, "Those recordings are Kurt's soul, not his music, not his lyrics. Those tapes, that's where he was most honest, most vulnerable, most himself, and I think he'd be horrified that anyone was listening to them, but also relieved that someone finally understood." Frances Bean Cobain, now an adult, has never publicly commented on the Montage of Heck tapes, but sources close to her say she's listened to portions of them and found comfort in hearing her father's voice in its most unguarded moments, even if what he was expressing was pain. The truth about Kurt Cobain isn't in the songs that made him famous. It's in the sounds nobody was supposed to hear.